Alexander Sterling could buy anything in the world except the one thing he craved most: someone who looked at him and saw more than dollar signs. Until the day a woman with paint-stained fingers and eyes like morning coffee told him the truth no one else dared speak. It's so great to have you here. If you're ready to dive into today's captivating story, please hit that subscribe button and drop a comment letting me know where you're tuning in from around the world. I love connecting with viewers from everywhere. Speaking of which, I've got another fascinating story lined up for you tomorrow that I think you'll find just as compelling as today's tale. Trust me, you won't want to miss it. But enough about tomorrow, let's jump into today's story. Alexander Sterling stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows of his penthouse office, watching the city sprawl beneath him like a conquered kingdom. At 34, he owned more real estate than some small countries, commanded markets with a single phone call, and had a net worth that made headlines. The irony wasn't lost on him that he felt utterly poor. His reflection stared back, sharp jaw, steel-gray eyes that had learned to read deception in boardrooms before most people learned to drive, and the kind of expensive suit that whispered rather than shouted wealth. Everything about Alexander Sterling was calculated, controlled, impenetrable. "Mr. Sterling?" His assistant's voice crackled through the intercom. "The Brooks Gallery called again about the charity auction tonight. They need confirmation on your attendance." Alexander's hand hovered over the response button. Another night of plastic smiles and strategic conversations, of people whose eyes lit up not with recognition of him but of his bank account. "Tell them yes," he said finally. "And remind security to do their usual background checks on anyone requesting FaceTime." He returned to the contract spread across his mahogany desk, but the numbers blurred together. At what point had caution become paranoia? When had protecting himself become the same as imprisoning himself? 3 miles across the city, Elena Rodriguez wiped acrylic paint from her hands with a rag that had seen better decades. Her small art studio occupied the ground floor of a converted warehouse, walls lined with canvases that exploded with color and emotion. Unlike the sterile perfection of corporate galleries, Elena's space felt alive, paint splatters on the concrete floor telling stories of creative passion, natural light streaming through tall windows, and the faint scent of turpentine mixing with the lavender candles she lit when working late. She stood before her latest piece, a portrait of an elderly man feeding pigeons in the park. His eyes held a loneliness that had called to her, and she'd spent weeks trying to capture not just his image but his soul. This was why she painted, to find the humanity in people, to show the world what others missed. "Elena, honey, you're going to be late." Her friend Maya's voice echoed from the small kitchen area where she was brewing coffee in mismatched mugs. "Late for what?" Elena stepped back from the painting, tilting her head to study the light she'd captured in the old man's eyes. "The Brooks Gallery event tonight. Remember? You said you'd help me serve at that fancy charity auction." Maya appeared with 2 steaming mugs, her cater-waiter uniform crisp and professional. "It's good money, and you need good money." Elena glanced at her paint-stained jeans and the stack of unpaid bills weighted down by a chipped ceramic elephant on her desk. Maya was right. Her art was finally gaining recognition, but recognition didn't pay rent. "Do I have to talk to people?" "Just serve champagne and smile. Though knowing you, you'll probably end up having deep conversations with half the room about the meaning of life." Maya grinned. "It's your superpower and your weakness." Elena accepted the coffee, inhaling the rich aroma. Unlike Alexander, she had learned early that honesty was both her compass and her shield. Growing up with a father who worked 3 jobs and a mother who taught her that integrity mattered more than income, Elena had never learned to wear masks. What you saw was what you got, and if people didn't like it, that was their loss. She looked again at the portrait of the lonely man. "Maybe tonight won't be so bad. Rich people are just people, right? They must have stories too." Maya laughed. "Oh, honey, you're going to be dangerous tonight." As Elena began to change into her server's uniform, she had no idea that across the city, a man who had everything was about to discover that sometimes the most valuable things came from the most unexpected places. And sometimes, the person who could save you was someone who had no idea you needed saving. The Brooks Gallery hummed with the kind of controlled energy that only came with old money and newer aspirations. Crystal chandeliers cast warm light over marble floors where Louboutin heels clicked in rhythm with hushed conversations about tax write-offs disguised as philanthropy. Alexander moved through the crowd like a shark through familiar waters, polished, predatory, and utterly alone despite being surrounded by hundreds of people. Alexander. There you are. Victoria Ashworth materialized beside him, her smile sharp enough to cut glass. I've been telling everyone about your latest acquisition. The Rothko collection? Simply divine. He accepted her air kisses with practiced indifference, already reading the calculation behind her emerald eyes. Victoria's family foundation needed funding, and she'd circle him all night until she found her opening. It's a good investment, he replied neutrally. Oh, you're so modest. Though I suppose when you have your resources. She let the sentence hang, baiting him into discussing his wealth. It was a dance he'd performed 1,000 times. The evening progressed predictably. A tech entrepreneur's wife complimented his philanthropic efforts while mentioning her husband's startup. A senator's son asked about his views on cryptocurrency regulation while positioning himself for a job recommendation. A socialite praised his taste in art while her husband lurked nearby, clearly angling for an investment opportunity. Alexander felt the familiar weight settling over him, the bone-deep exhaustion that came from being valued only for what he could provide. He was retreating toward the quieter sculpture wing when a server with a champagne tray accidentally backed into him. Oh! The woman spun around, her brown eyes wide with genuine alarm. I'm so sorry, I didn't see, she stopped mid-sentence, taking in his expensive tuxedo. Oh no, did I spill anything on you? Alexander looked down at his pristine jacket, then back at her face. She wasn't looking at him the way everyone else did, with that subtle shift that happened when people recognized who he was. Instead, her concern seemed entirely focused on whether she'd caused him any inconvenience. I'm fine, he said. Are you sure? Because this champagne probably costs more than I make in a month, and if I ruined a tuxedo that probably costs more than I make in a year. She trailed off, her honesty so refreshing it caught him off guard. Really, it's fine. He found himself almost smiling. Though you're probably right about the champagne. Elena laughed, not the tinkling calculated sound he was used to, but something genuine and warm. At least I'm honest about being out of my league here. I'm Elena, by the way. Professional champagne spiller, apparently. Alexander. He waited for the moment of recognition, the subtle change in her demeanor that always came when people connected his name to his reputation. It didn't come. Nice to meet you, Alexander. Are you enjoying the auction? I've been watching people bid, and it's fascinating. Like a very polite gladiator match, but with paddle fans. He studied her face, searching for any sign that she was playing a game. Her uniform suggested she was staff, but her ease in conversation and the paint stain he could see peeking from under her cuff sleeve suggested she was an artist. You're observant. Occupational hazard. I'm a painter, so I notice things. Like how you've been moving around the room in a very specific pattern, staying near exits, avoiding clusters of people. She tilted her head slightly. Either you're planning a heist, or you don't really want to be here. The accuracy of her observation should have alarmed him. Instead, it intrigued him. What makes you think I don't want to be here? Your shoulders. They're tense, like you're carrying something heavy. And you smile at people, but it never reaches your eyes. She paused, looking slightly embarrassed. Sorry, I have a terrible habit of reading people. My friend Maya says it makes me dangerous at parties. Alexander felt something shift inside his chest, a crack in walls he'd spent years fortifying. Here was someone who saw him not as a walking bank account or a networking opportunity, but as a person. A tired, guarded person, but a person nonetheless. Your friend might be right, he said quietly. Before Elena could respond, a sharp voice cut through their conversation. "Alexander, darling." Vivian Montgomery, heir to a media empire and someone who'd been pursuing him for months, appeared at his elbow. Her gaze swept over Elena with practiced dismissal. "I've been looking everywhere for you. You simply must meet Daddy's new business partner from Singapore." Elena stepped back automatically, recognizing the social hierarchy at play. Alexander caught the movement, saw how she retreated without resentment or calculation, simply making space for someone whose claim on his attention seemed more legitimate. "I should get back to work anyway," Elena said, lifting her champagne tray. "Nice meeting you, Alexander." As she started to move away, Alexander made a decision that surprised him. "Elena." She turned back, eyebrows raised. "What you said about reading people, what else do you see?" She looked at him for a long moment, her expression growing serious. "I see someone who's forgotten what it feels like to trust someone." The words hit him like a physical blow. Not because they were cruel, but because they were true. In a room full of people who would tell him whatever they thought he wanted to hear, she'd given him the truth. "Elena, we need more champagne at the West Bar," Maya appeared, gently pulling her friend away. As Elena disappeared into the crowd, Alexander stood frozen. For the first time in years, someone had looked at him and seen not his potential value but his pain. And instead of trying to exploit it, she'd simply acknowledged it and walked away. Vivian's voice seemed to come from underwater. "Alexander? Are you listening?" He wasn't. He was watching a woman with paint-stained fingers serve champagne to people who would never see her the way she'd just seen him, completely honestly, and without agenda. Something had just changed, though he couldn't yet name what. Alexander spent the next hour moving through the gala like a man trying to outrun his own shadow. He bid on a sculpture he didn't want, wrote a check to a foundation he'd never heard of, and engaged in 3 separate conversations about market volatility, all while his mind replayed 4 words: someone who's forgotten what it feels like to trust. By the time he reached the bar for his second scotch, he'd almost convinced himself that Elena was just another opportunist with a different approach. The whole honest observer routine was probably calculated, designed to intrigue him precisely because it was unexpected. He'd built his fortune on reading people, and nobody was that genuine without an agenda. Rough night. The bartender, a man in his 60s with kind eyes, slid the glass across the marble surface. "They all are," Alexander replied, then immediately regretted the honesty. He didn't make personal revelations to strangers. "I've been working these events for 20 years, the bartender said, polishing glasses with practiced efficiency. Seen a lot of folks who look like they're drowning in their own success." Alexander took a sip of scotch, the amber liquid burning away the uncomfortable truth of the observation. "Success requires sacrifice." "Sure does. Question is whether what you're sacrificing is worth more than what you're gaining." Before Alexander could respond, a commotion near the auction stage drew his attention. Elena was there, crouched beside an elderly woman who appeared to have stumbled. While other guests maintained a polite distance, Elena had abandoned her champagne tray and was gently helping the woman to a chair, speaking in low, soothing tones. He watched as Elena retrieved the woman's dropped purse, stayed with her until medical personnel arrived, and only returned to her serving duties when she was certain the woman was okay. No one had asked her to help. No one was watching or taking note for social credit. She'd simply seen someone who needed assistance and provided it. Alexander's carefully constructed rationalization crumbled. Elena's hands shook slightly as she refilled champagne flutes at the West Bar. The encounter with Alexander had rattled her more than she wanted to admit, not because of anything he'd said, but because of what she'd seen in his eyes when she'd spoken about trust. She'd grown up reading her father's face when he came home from his construction job, learning to see past his forced cheerfulness to the exhaustion beneath. She'd watched her mother's gentle persistence slowly heal neighbors who'd been hurt by life's cruelties. Elena had inherited both skills, the ability to see truth and the instinct to offer comfort. But something about Alexander was different. His walls weren't just protective, they were architectural marvels, built with the precision of someone who'd been hurt not just once but systematically. The kind of defenses that didn't develop overnight. "You okay?" Maya appeared beside her, concern creasing her forehead. "You've been weird since you spilled champagne on that guy." "I didn't spill anything on him," Elena corrected automatically. "Then why do you look like you've seen a ghost?" Elena paused in her champagne distribution. How could she explain that for a moment, she'd looked into someone's eyes and seen a loneliness so profound it made her own struggle seem insignificant? That she'd met someone who had everything and felt utterly empty? "He just seemed sad," she said finally. Maya followed Elena's gaze across the room to where Alexander stood at the bar, looking every inch the successful billionaire. "Honey, that man probably has more money than God. What does he have to be sad about?" "Money doesn't cure loneliness." "Spoken like someone who's never had enough money," Maya replied, but not unkindly. "Trust me, rich people's problems are different from our problems." Elena knew Maya was trying to protect her. Her friend had watched Elena give too much of herself to too many people who didn't appreciate it. But something about Alexander felt different. His sadness wasn't self-pity or entitlement, it was genuine isolation. "I should stay focused on work," Elena said, more to herself than to Maya. "Good plan. We need this job." But even as Elena tried to concentrate on serving drinks and avoiding any further interaction with Alexander Sterling, she found herself acutely aware of his presence in the room. When Vivian Montgomery monopolized his conversation, Elena noticed how his jaw tightened. When a group of businessmen cornered him near the auction items, she saw how he positioned himself with his back to the wall. The resistance came to a head when Elena was clearing glasses from a high-top table near the gallery's main entrance. Alexander appeared beside her, so quietly she startled. "You're very observant," he said without preamble. Elena's pulse quickened, but she kept her voice steady. "You mentioned that earlier. I've been thinking about what you said. About trust." His gray eyes searched her face. "What made you say that?" Elena set down the tray of glasses, considering her words carefully. The smart thing would be to deflect, to laugh it off as a random observation. But looking at him now, she couldn't bring herself to be anything less than honest. "Because you move through this room like you're surrounded by enemies instead of guests. Because when people approach you, you calculate before you speak. Because—" She hesitated, then forged ahead. "Because you looked relieved when I didn't recognize you." Alexander's expression didn't change, but something flickered in his eyes. "And what if I told you that experience has taught me that trust is a luxury I can't afford? Then I'd say that's the saddest thing I've ever heard." The simple sincerity of her response hit him like a sucker punch. No argument, no attempt to convince him otherwise, just genuine sorrow for his situation. It was exactly the kind of response that made him want to believe her, and exactly why he couldn't. "You don't know anything about my life," he said, his voice colder than he intended. Elena didn't flinch. "You're right. I don't. But I know what loneliness looks like, and I know what it costs." "Elena." Maya's voice cut through the tension. "We need to start cleanup. The event's winding down." Alexander watched Elena's face transform as she turned toward her friend, from serious and compassionate to warm and natural. The transition reminded him of everything he'd lost, everything he'd chosen to sacrifice for security. "I should go," Elena said, turning back to him. "But for what it's worth, I don't think trust is a luxury. I think it's a necessity. And I think you know that too." She walked away before he could respond, leaving Alexander standing alone among the remnants of an evening that had started like every other social obligation and ended with his carefully ordered world feeling significantly less stable. As the last guests filtered out and staff began breaking down the event, neither Alexander nor Elena realized that their brief encounter had set something in motion that would prove impossible to stop. Sometimes the most dangerous conversations were the ones that told the truth. 3 days later, Alexander stood outside a converted warehouse in a part of the city he rarely visited, questioning his sanity. He'd spent 72 hours trying to forget Elena Rodriguez and her unsettling observations, but her words had burrowed under his skin like a splinter. When his private investigator, hired more out of curiosity than suspicion, had provided her address along with information about her struggling art career, Alexander had made an impulsive decision that went against every principle of self-preservation he'd cultivated. The building looked like it had seen better decades. Brick walls weathered by time, industrial windows that had been converted from functional to artistic necessity, and a small placard that read Rodriguez Studio in hand-painted letters. Nothing about it suggested the kind of polished professionalism Alexander was accustomed to, yet something about its authenticity drew him forward. He knocked on the heavy wooden door, immediately second-guessing his decision. What was he doing here? What could he possibly say that wouldn't sound either condescending or stalkerish? The door opened, and Elena appeared in paint-splattered overalls, her hair pulled back in a messy bun secured with what appeared to be a paintbrush. Her expression shifted from mild curiosity to genuine surprise when she recognized him. Alexander. She blinked, as if confirming he wasn't a hallucination. What are you doing here? He found himself uncharacteristically at a loss for words. I wanted to see your art. Elena tilted her head, studying him with the same perceptive gaze that had unnerved him at the gallery. How did you find me? The honest answer would reveal that he'd had her investigated, which would only confirm her assessment of his trust issues. I asked around, he said instead, which was technically true. She considered this for a moment, then stepped aside. Well, since you're here, you might as well come in. Fair warning, it's not exactly penthouse aesthetic. Alexander stepped into the studio and felt something inside him ease. The space was alive in a way his sterile offices and pristine penthouse never were. Canvases lined the walls in various stages of completion, from rough sketches to finished pieces that seemed to pulse with emotion. Natural light streamed through tall windows, illuminating paint-splattered floors that told stories of creative passion. The air smelled of turpentine and coffee, with underlying notes of something distinctly Elena, warm and honest and real. This is... He stopped, searching for words that wouldn't sound patronizing. Chaotic. Elena supplied, wiping her hands on a rag. Maya says it looks like a rainbow exploded in here. Alive, Alexander finished quietly. Elena paused in her cleaning, looking at him with surprise. That's not what I expected you to say. He moved closer to a large canvas depicting a homeless veteran feeding pigeons in a park. The man's eyes held a dignity that transcended his circumstances, painted with such empathy that Alexander felt like an intruder on an intimate moment. You paint people, he observed. I paint souls, Elena corrected. People's outsides lie all the time. Their souls don't. Alexander studied another painting, a young mother holding a crying baby, exhaustion and love warring in her expression. And what do you see when you look at souls? Usually, pain that's been dressed up as something else. Joy that people are afraid to claim. Love that's hiding behind fear. She moved to stand beside him, close enough that he could smell paint and something floral, soap maybe or shampoo. Everyone's carrying something. And you think you can fix them with art? Elena turned to face him fully. I don't fix anything. I just show people what I see, and sometimes that helps them see it too. Alexander felt the familiar walls rising. This conversation was venturing into territory that made him uncomfortable. The suggestion that people could be known, understood, helped. That sounds naive. Maybe. But I'd rather be naive than cynical. Before he could respond, Elena's phone buzzed. She glanced at it, and her expression shifted to worry. Problem? Alexander asked. My landlord. The building's been sold, and the new owners want to convert these studios into luxury condos. I have 60 days to find a new space. She set the phone down with forced casualness, but Alexander could see the stress in the tight line of her shoulders. "What will you do?" Elena gestured around the studio. "Find somewhere else, I suppose. Those spaces like this aren't exactly common, and what I can afford is—" She shrugged. "Well, let's just say my art career is more passion than profit at the moment." Alexander found himself saying, "I have properties. Lots of them. Some might work for studios." Elena's eyes widened. "I couldn't afford anything you own." What if affordability wasn't the issue? The question hung between them, loaded with implications neither was ready to examine. Elena studied his face, clearly trying to read his motivations. "Why would you help me?" It was a fair question, and one Alexander wasn't sure he could answer honestly. Because her art moved him? Because her honesty intrigued him? Because for the first time in years, he'd found someone who saw him as a person rather than a bank account? "Maybe because you're right," he said finally. "Maybe trust isn't a luxury." Elena's expression softened. "Alexander, I appreciate the offer, but I don't want charity." What if it wasn't charity? What if it was a commission? A commission? Alexander moved to another painting, this one of an elderly couple sharing a bench, their hands intertwined despite the obvious weariness in their faces. "I need art for a new hotel I'm developing. Original pieces that tell stories. Human stories." Elena was quiet for so long that Alexander wondered if he'd overstepped. When she finally spoke, her voice was careful. "You want to hire me to paint for your hotel?" "I want to hire you to do what you do, show people souls. But in a space where thousands of people will see them every day." That would be. Elena paused, calculations running behind her eyes. That would be a significant commission. It would be. But it would also mean working closely together for several weeks. Planning, concepts, execution. He met her gaze directly. "Are you comfortable with that?" Elena looked around her studio, at the paintings that represented her passion, at the space that was about to be taken from her, at the opportunity standing in front of her wearing a perfectly tailored suit and carrying enough complications to sink a small ship. "I have one condition," she said finally. "Name it." During this project, in this space, were just Alexander and Elena. Not billionaire and struggling artist. Just two people working together. Alexander felt something shift in his chest, a loosening of defenses he'd held so long they'd become part of his identity. "I'm not sure I remember how to be just Alexander." Elena smiled then, the first truly warm smile she'd given him. "Then I guess we'll figure it out together." 2 weeks into their collaboration, Elena had transformed a corner of her studio into a planning space where concepts for Alexander's hotel art collection covered every available surface. Sketches, color palettes, and reference photos created a controlled chaos that somehow made perfect sense to both of them. Alexander had started arriving each morning with coffee, 2 cups, one black for him, one with cream and ridiculous amounts of sugar for her, and staying until the afternoon light began to fade. It was during one of these sessions, while Elena was adjusting a preliminary sketch of a painting depicting a father teaching his daughter to ride a bicycle, that she noticed Alexander go completely still. "What is it?" she asked, following his gaze to the drawing. Alexander's jaw had tightened, and his hands clenched into fists at his sides. "Nothing. The composition is good." But Elena had spent weeks learning to read his micro-expressions, the subtle tells that revealed when he was retreating behind his walls. This wasn't his usual guarded response. This was pain, raw and immediate. "Alexander." Her voice was gentle but firm. "What are you seeing?" He turned away from the sketch, moving toward the windows that overlooked the alley behind her building. "We should focus on the more abstract pieces. Corporate art doesn't need to be so personal." Elena set down her pencil and moved to stand beside him, not close enough to crowd but near enough to offer presence. 3 weeks ago, you told me you wanted human stories. What changed?" Nothing changed. I just think. Your father taught you to ride a bike. The statement hung between them like a challenge. Alexander's reflection in the window showed Elena everything she needed to know. The tightness around his eyes, the careful control of his breathing, the way he held himself like a man preparing for a blow. How could you possibly know that? Because you looked at that drawing the same way I look at paintings of my mother's hands. Like you're seeing something that used to be beautiful before it became painful. Alexander was quiet for so long Elena wondered if he would retreat completely. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. I was 7. He spent an entire Saturday afternoon in Central Park, running behind my bike, promising he wouldn't let go. Alexander's reflection smiled bitterly. He kept his promise that day. It was one of the last ones he ever kept. Elena waited, understanding instinctively that silence was the only invitation he could accept. Robert Sterling was a brilliant businessman and a terrible father. By the time I was 10, I'd learned that his promises were just words, that his affection was conditional on my usefulness, and that the people who claimed to love me most were often the ones who hurt me deepest. Alexander's hands pressed against the window glass. When I was 14, I caught him having an affair with his business partner's wife. When I confronted him, he didn't deny it. He just explained the strategic advantages of the relationship. Elena felt something crack open in her chest. Alexander. He taught me that everyone has an angle, everyone wants something, and trust is just a weakness that people exploit. And you know what? He was right. When he died 5 years ago, half the people at his funeral were there to network, and the other half were trying to figure out how his death would benefit them. Elena turned to face him fully, seeing now the source of the walls he'd built so carefully. Is that why you had me investigated? Alexander's head snapped toward her, surprise replacing the distant pain in his eyes. How did you? Because you knew things about me you shouldn't have known. My full name, where I grew up, details about my family. Elena's voice held no accusation, only understanding. Your father taught you that knowledge is protection. Elena, It's okay. She moved closer, close enough to see the conflict warring in his gray eyes. I understand why you needed to know who I was before you could trust who I am. Alexander studied her face, searching for signs of anger or hurt. Finding none unsettled him more than finding them would have. You should be furious. Should I? You've spent your entire life learning that people lie, manipulate, and betray. Of course you'd want to protect yourself. Elena leaned against the window frame, her shoulder almost touching his. The question is, what did your investigation tell you? That you're exactly who you appear to be. That you've never taken advantage of anyone, never manipulated a situation for personal gain, never. He paused. Never been anything but honest, even when honesty cost you. Elena was quiet for a moment, then surprised him by asking, what else did it tell you? Alexander hesitated. The investigation had revealed more than just Elena's character. It had shown him her struggles, her sacrifices, her own hidden pain. That you've spent your entire adult life taking care of other people. Your parents, your community, struggling artists who couldn't pay you for commissioned work. And that you've never asked for anything in return. Elena smiled sadly. That's where you're wrong. I ask for things all the time. I just don't ask for things that can be bought. What do you ask for? Truth. Presence. Someone who sees me as more than just a caretaker or a convenience. Elena's voice grew softer. My investigation told me some things too. Alexander tensed. What investigation? The kind anyone can do with Google and a willingness to see patterns. Elena moved to sit on the paint-splattered stool near her easel. Robert Sterling's son, heir to a fortune built on real estate and strategic manipulation. A man who's been photographed at 1,000 charity events, but never with the same woman twice. Someone who gives generously to causes, but never gets personally involved. That's not an investigation, that's public record. The investigation was watching you. Really watching. Elena's eyes met his. You tip service workers more than their wages. You remember names of people others forget. You ask about families, health problems, not because you want something, but because you care. Your employees have college funds for their children and health care that covers everything because you know what it feels like to have a father who sees people as assets. Alexander felt exposed, as if Elena had somehow seen through walls he'd spent decades constructing. I'm not him, he said quietly. No, you're not. But you're so afraid of becoming him that you've forgotten how to be yourself. The truth of it hit him like a physical blow. For 34 years, he'd measured every relationship, every interaction, every moment of vulnerability against the template of his father's betrayals. He'd become so focused on not being Robert Sterling that he'd lost track of who Alexander Sterling actually was. I don't know how to be anything else, he admitted. Elena stood and moved toward him, stopping just close enough that he could see the paint stain on her left wrist, smell the soap she used, feel the warmth of her presence. Then maybe it's time to find out. The breakthrough came on a Thursday afternoon when Elena was mixing paint colors for a piece depicting an elderly jazz musician. Alexander sat in the worn leather chair she dragged over from the corner, laptop balanced on his knees as he worked on what he claimed were boring hotel logistics, but which Elena suspected were emails that affected thousands of lives and millions of dollars. They'd fallen into an easy rhythm over the past week, working in comfortable silence punctuated by conversations that ranged from art theory to Alexander's surprising knowledge of obscure jazz musicians. The revelation that he played piano had come out accidentally when Elena mentioned the musicality of certain brushstrokes, and Alexander had responded with a technical understanding that only came from personal experience. Play something, Elena said suddenly, looking up from her palette. What? You keep looking at that old piano in the corner like it's calling to you. And I happen to know it's perfectly tuned because Mrs. Chen upstairs is a retired music teacher who maintains it. Alexander followed her gaze to the upright piano that had come with the studio space, its dark wood scarred but dignified. I don't really play anymore. When did you stop? The question was casual, but Alexander recognized the weight behind it. Elena had a way of asking simple questions that opened complicated doors. When my father decided piano lessons were a waste of time that could be better spent learning about market analysis. How old were you? 12. Elena set down her brush and turned to face him fully. Alexander Sterling, you are 34 years old, sitting in an art studio on a Thursday afternoon, working with someone who thinks creativity matters more than profit margins. If that's not exactly the right time to play piano again, I don't know what is. Something in her tone, part challenge, part invitation, holy Elena, made Alexander close his laptop and stand. He approached the piano cautiously, as if it might bite him, then lifted the bench seat and sat down. His fingers hovered over the keys, muscle memory warring with years of denial. I might be terrible at this, he warned. Then you'll be terrible at it. So what? Alexander pressed a single key middle C, and the note resonated through the studio with surprising warmth. Then, without quite deciding to do it, he began to play. The melody that emerged was tentative at first, then growing stronger as his fingers remembered their purpose. It was Chopin's Nocturne in E-flat major, a piece he'd loved as a child for its combination of melancholy and hope. The music filled the space between them, erasing years of silence and self-denial. Elena set down her palette and moved closer, drawn by the unexpected beauty of Alexander's playing. This wasn't the careful, controlled man she'd come to know. This was someone lost in expression, vulnerable in a way that had nothing to do with business strategies or trust issues. When the last note faded, the silence felt different than before, fuller, more intimate. That was beautiful, Elena said softly. Alexander looked down at his hands as if surprised to find them on the keys. I'd forgotten. What? How good it felt. To create something instead of just acquiring it. Elena smiled, settling onto the floor beside the piano bench. Music and art are cousins, you know. Both about finding the truth that lives underneath surface things. Is that your professional opinion, Dr. Rodriguez? That's my professional opinion, Dr. Sterling. Elena grinned. Though I'm pretty sure neither of us actually has a doctorate in anything. Alexander laughed, actually laughed, and the sound was so unexpected that Elena felt something warm bloom in her chest. When was the last time someone had made this man laugh without wanting something in return? Tell me something, Elena said, settling more comfortably against the wall. When you were a kid, before everything got complicated, what did you want to be when you grew up? Alexander's fingers traced silent patterns on the piano keys. You'll think it's ridiculous. Try me. An architect. I used to build these elaborate cities with Legos, spending hours planning how people would move through the spaces, where they'd feel safe, where they'd gather. He smiled at the memory. I wanted to design places that made people happy. Elena felt her heart squeeze. That's not ridiculous at all. In fact, it's exactly what you're doing now. How do you figure that? This hotel project, you're not just building a place for people to sleep. You're creating spaces where they'll feel welcome, where art will surprise them, where they might discover something about themselves. Elena tucked her legs under herself. You're still designing places that make people happy. You just forgot that's what you were doing. Alexander looked at her with an expression Elena couldn't quite read. How do you do that? Do what? See the good in everything, even in me. Elena's voice grew gentle. Alexander, you don't need me to see the good in you. You need to see it yourself. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, afternoon light shifting through the windows and painting patterns on the studio floor. Alexander found himself studying Elena's profile as she watched dust motes dance in the sunbeams. The slight upturn of her nose, the way she worried her bottom lip when thinking, the paint smudge on her temple that she'd somehow missed every time she'd washed her hands. Can I ask you something? He said finally. Always. Why aren't you afraid of me? Elena turned to meet his gaze. Should I be? Most people are, at least a little. Even when they want something from me, there's an undercurrent of intimidation. You don't have that. Elena considered this seriously. I think fear and respect are different things. I respect your intelligence, your success, your ability to change people's lives with a phone call. But I'm not afraid of you because I know what you're afraid of. What am I afraid of? The same thing I am. That if someone really sees you, all of you, they might decide you're not worth staying for. The accuracy of her observation should have terrified him. Instead, it felt like relief. And what if they do? Elena's smile was soft but sure. Then they're idiots, and you're better off without them. As the afternoon dissolved into evening, neither Alexander nor Elena wanted to acknowledge that their professional relationship had shifted into something else entirely. Something that felt dangerous and necessary and absolutely worth the risk. For the first time in decades, Alexander Sterling felt like he might be enough, exactly as he was. And for the first time in years, Elena Rodriguez felt like she might have found someone who could see her as more than just a safe harbor for everyone else's storms. Neither realized that their growing closeness was about to be tested in ways that would challenge everything they thought they knew about trust, truth, and the courage required to love someone completely. The betrayal came disguised as a business opportunity. Alexander was reviewing contracts in Elena's studio on a Friday morning when his phone rang. Marcus Webb, his head of acquisitions, rarely called with good news, and today was no exception. Alexander, we have a problem with the Riverside Development Project. Elena looked up from the canvas she was working on, a piece depicting a couple sharing coffee on a park bench, their hands almost touching. She'd been capturing something in their faces that spoke of trust tentatively offered, and the irony wasn't lost on her now. What kind of problem? Alexander's voice had shifted to its business tone, the warmth from moments before evaporating. The artist you've commissioned for the hotel project. Elena Rodriguez. She's been feeding information to the community opposition group. Elena's brush froze mid-stroke. What? Alexander held up a hand, his gray eyes already hardening. Explain. She's been attending their meetings, providing them with details about the hotel's timeline, budget allocations, even interior plans. They're using her information to file injunctions, delay permits. The whole project could be derailed. Elena stood slowly, paintbrush still in her hand. Alexander, I can explain. But Alexander was no longer looking at her. His entire body had gone rigid, the careful wall she'd watched him lower over the past month slamming back into place with devastating efficiency. How long have you known? Marcus continued through the phone. Because if you've been aware that she's been working against the project while taking your money. I wasn't aware, Alexander said, his voice ice-cold. He finally looked at Elena, and she felt her heart break at what she saw in his eyes. Not anger. She could have fought anger. This was worse. This was the look of a man who'd been proved right about his worst assumptions. Alexander, please. Send me everything you have, he told Marcus, then ended the call. The silence in the studio felt like a living thing, heavy and poisonous. Elena set down her brush with shaking hands. I can explain, she said again. Can you? Alexander's voice was conversational, which somehow made it more terrifying than if he'd shouted. Because from where I'm standing, it looks like you've been playing a very long game. That's not what this is. Alexander laughed, but the sound held no humor. Of course it's not. Let me guess, you're fighting for your community. Standing up for the little people against the big bad billionaire. Very noble. Elena felt tears sting her eyes, but she blinked them back. You don't understand. Oh, I understand perfectly. Alexander began pacing, his movements sharp and agitated. This is exactly what my father warned me about. Get close to someone, let them see your vulnerabilities, and they'll use everything they know against you. Alexander, stop. Please just listen. Listen to what? More lies. He spun to face her, and Elena was shocked by the raw pain in his expression. God, you're good. You're really, really good. The whole I see your soul routine, the way you made me believe someone could actually. You played me perfectly. I never played you. Yes, I've been attending community meetings, but you forgot to mention that small detail during our heart-to-heart conversations about trust? Elena's temper flared. I've been attending those meetings for 2 years, long before I met you. They're my neighbors, my community. When they heard about the development, they were scared about displacement, about losing their homes. I went to listen, to understand, and to gather intelligence, to help them understand what was really happening. Elena's voice rose. Do you know what I told them at the last meeting? I told them that maybe they judged you too quickly. I told them that you weren't the kind of developer who would destroy a community for profit. I defended you. Alexander stopped pacing. What? I told them about the affordable housing provisions you'd built into the project that weren't in the public plans. I explained that you were trying to preserve the community center and create job opportunities for local residents. Elena's voice broke slightly. I told them that maybe, for once, they could trust someone with money and power to do the right thing. That's not, Marcus said. Marcus said what he needed to say to protect a project worth hundreds of millions of dollars. Elena wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, leaving a streak of paint across her cheek. Did he mention that the opposition group has completely changed their stance? That they're now supporting the development because they finally understand what you're actually trying to build? Alexander felt something crack inside his chest. Elena. Did he mention that I've spent weeks trying to bridge the gap between your vision and their fears? That I've been using everything I learned working with you to help them see that you're not the enemy. No, he didn't mention that. Elena sat down heavily on her painting stool, suddenly exhausted. Of course he didn't. Because that narrative doesn't serve the story he wants to tell. Alexander sank into the leather chair, his head in his hands. Jesus, Elena. I'm sorry. When he said I'd betrayed you, you believed him. Immediately. Without question. Elena's voice was quiet now, but Alexander could hear the hurt underneath. Because that's what you expect from people. That's what you've been waiting for. That's not fair. Isn't it? Elena stood and walked to the window, looking out at the alley where morning light struggled through urban haze. For 6 weeks, I've been showing you who I am. Every day, in every conversation, in every moment we've shared. But one phone call from someone you barely trust was enough to erase all of that. Alexander wanted to argue, to defend himself, but the words died in his throat because she was right. The moment Marcus had suggested Elena might be using him, Alexander had defaulted to every lesson his father had ever taught him about trust being a weakness and love being a luxury he couldn't afford. I don't know how to do this, he said quietly. Do what? Trust someone. Really trust them. Not just intellectually, but... He gestured helplessly. In my bones, in my gut, in the places where fear lives. I want to, Elena. God, I want to. But every time I start to believe that someone might actually see me and stay, something in me starts looking for the exit signs. Elena turned from the window, and Alexander was devastated to see tears streaming down her face. I know, she whispered. I know you want to. But wanting isn't enough, Alexander. At some point, you have to choose to trust me. You have to choose to believe that I'm here for the right reasons, even when someone gives you reasons to doubt. How do I do that? I don't know. But I know that I can't keep proving myself to you over and over again. I can't keep being guilty until proven innocent every time someone plants a seed of doubt. Elena wiped her face with her sleeve. I love you, Alexander. I love your wounded heart and your brilliant mind and the way you play piano like you're having a conversation with your soul. But I can't love you enough for both of us. The words hit Alexander like a physical blow. Elena, please. I think you should go. Don't do this. Don't give up on us. Elena's smile was heartbreaking. I'm not giving up on us. I'm giving you space to decide if there's an us you actually want to fight for. Alexander stood, everything in him screaming to stay, to fix this, to somehow undo the damage his fear had caused. But Elena had turned back to the window, her shoulders set in a way that told him the conversation was over. As he walked toward the door, Alexander felt like he was leaving more than just Elena's studio. He was walking away from the first person who'd ever made him believe he could be loved for who he was rather than what he could provide. And the cruelest part was that he'd driven her away not through any conscious choice, but through the unconscious programming of a lifetime spent learning that everyone eventually leaves. Alexander spent the next 3 days in a purgatory of his own making. He sat in his penthouse office, surrounded by the empire he'd built, watching the city move below him like pieces on a chessboard he'd learned to master. Every deal, every negotiation, every strategic decision had been made from this position of elevated isolation. It had always felt like power. Now it felt like a prison. Marcus had been by twice with updates on the Riverside project. Community support was indeed growing, permits were moving forward smoothly, and the opposition group had formally endorsed the development. Each piece of information was another confirmation that Elena had been telling the truth, that his fear had made him the villain in their story. Mr. Sterling? His assistant's voice crackled through the intercom. Your mother is here to see you. Alexander closed his eyes. Margaret Sterling rarely visited unannounced, and her timing suggested that news of his personal life had somehow reached her. Send her in. Margaret Sterling entered with the quiet authority of someone who'd spent decades navigating the social minefields of extreme wealth. At 62, she remained elegant and sharp, her silver hair perfectly styled and her designer suit impeccable. But Alexander caught something in her expression he rarely saw: maternal concern. "You look terrible," she said without preamble, settling into the chair across from his desk. "Good afternoon to you too, Mother." "Don't be flippant, Alexander. I had lunch with Victoria Ashworth yesterday. She mentioned you've been distracted lately. Something about an artist." Alexander's jaw tightened. "Victoria talks too much. Victoria's harmless, but she's also observant." Margaret studied her son's face. "Who is she?" "Who is who?" "The woman who's made you look like someone ran over your favorite pet." Despite everything, Alexander almost smiled. His mother's directness was one of her more endearing qualities. "It doesn't matter. It's over." "Ah." Margaret leaned back in her chair. "And why is it over?" Alexander stood and moved to the windows, the same position he'd occupied countless times when trying to solve problems through sheer force of will. "Because I'm my father's son." "Alexander James Sterling, that is the stupidest thing you've ever said to me." He turned, surprised by the steel in her voice. "Your father was many things: brilliant, driven, successful. He was also paranoid, controlling, and incapable of trusting anyone, including the people who loved him most." Margaret's voice grew quiet. "Including me." Alexander had never heard his mother speak this directly about his father's flaws. "Mother, do you know why I stayed married to him for 28 years? She didn't wait for an answer. Because I kept hoping that one day he'd realize that I was on his side. That I wasn't trying to take anything from him or use him for anything other than the fact that I loved him." Margaret's eyes grew distant. "I waited 28 years for him to trust me. He never did." "That's different." "Is it? Because from where I'm sitting, it sounds like you just repeated his greatest mistake." Alexander felt something cold settle in his stomach. "You don't understand the situation." "Then explain it to me." So he did. Alexander found himself telling his mother about Elena, about her art, her honesty, her ability to see through his defenses to something worth loving. He told her about the community meetings, Marcus's phone call, and the devastating moment when his fear had overridden everything he'd learned about Elena's character. Margaret listened without interruption, her expression growing more thoughtful with each detail. "This woman," she said when he finished, "she defended you to people who had every reason to distrust you?" "Yes." "She used her influence to help your project succeed, even though she knew it might cost her credibility with her own community?" "Yes." "And when you accused her of betraying you, she didn't fight back with anger or manipulation. She told you the truth and asked you to choose to trust her." Alexander's throat felt tight. "Yes." Margaret was quiet for a long moment. "Alexander, I'm going to tell you something I should have told you years ago. Your father's inability to trust wasn't wisdom. It was cowardice. He was protecting himself. He was protecting himself from the possibility of being hurt, yes. But in doing so, he guaranteed that he'd never experience real love, real partnership, real intimacy." Margaret stood and moved to stand beside her son at the window. "He chose safety over connection, and it made him the loneliest man I've ever known." Alexander felt tears sting his eyes. "I don't know how to be different." "Yes, you do. You've been different with this woman. You've been the man you were meant to be before fear taught you to hide." Margaret placed a gentle hand on his arm. "The question is whether you're brave enough to be that man permanently." Across the city, Elena sat on the floor of her nearly empty studio, surrounded by canvases she was preparing to pack. The landlord had agreed to let her stay until the end of the month, but most of her work was already crated and ready for storage while she searched for a new space. She'd been numb for 3 days, moving through the motions of dismantling the life she'd built here while trying not to think about the way Alexander's face had looked when he'd stopped trusting her. Maya had been by each morning with coffee and worried glances, but Elena wasn't ready to dissect what had happened. Not yet. Her phone buzzed with a text from her mother. "Mija, you've been quiet. Everything okay?" Elena stared at the message for a long time before typing back, "Just some work stuff. I'll call you this weekend." Is this about a man? Elena almost laughed. Her mother's intuition was legendary. Maybe. Want to talk about it? Elena's fingers hovered over the keyboard. Did she want to talk about falling in love with someone who couldn't quite love her back? About giving her heart to a man whose wounds ran so deep he couldn't see past them to the healing she was offering? "I don't think he can trust me enough to love me," she typed finally. Her mother's response came quickly. "The question isn't whether he can, Mija. It's whether he will choose to." Elena set down the phone and looked around her studio, at the paintings that represented years of seeing the best in people, of believing that everyone had a story worth telling, of choosing hope over cynicism again and again. She thought about Alexander at the piano, his face open and vulnerable as music poured from his fingers. She thought about the way he'd looked at her art, seeing not just technique but soul. She thought about the careful way he'd learned to laugh again, the tenderness he'd shown when sharing his memories of his father, the gradual lowering of walls that had taken him decades to build. And she thought about the choice she faced now: protect herself from further hurt, or believe that the man she'd glimpsed behind the fear was worth fighting for. Elena pulled out her phone and scrolled to Alexander's number. Her thumb hovered over the call button for what felt like hours. Finally, she made her choice. But instead of calling, she set the phone aside and picked up her paintbrush. If Alexander Sterling was going to choose trust over fear, he needed to know exactly what he'd be choosing. And Elena Rodriguez knew only one way to show people the truth that lived underneath surface things. She began to paint. The next morning, Alexander found a package outside his penthouse door. No delivery notice, no return address, just his name written in Elena's careful handwriting across brown paper. Inside, wrapped in soft cloth, was a canvas roughly the size of a sheet of paper. It was a portrait of him, but not as he appeared in mirrors or photographs. This was how Elena saw him: eyes that held both strength and vulnerability, a mouth that suggested words he was afraid to speak, hands that were powerful but gentle. In the background, barely visible but unmistakably present, was the shadow of piano keys. At the bottom of the painting, in Elena's flowing script, were 5 words: "The man worth choosing to trust." Alexander sank into his leather chair, the painting trembling in his hands. This wasn't manipulation or strategy or calculation. This was love, offered freely and without condition, asking nothing but hoping for everything. For the first time in his adult life, Alexander Sterling understood the difference between being afraid and choosing fear. He'd spent so many years conflating the two that he'd forgotten he had a choice. He looked at Elena's painting of him, at the man she saw when she looked past his defenses, and made the most terrifying and necessary decision of his life. He chose to trust her. Not because it was safe, but because she was worth the risk. And then Alexander Sterling, billionaire and perpetual cynic, did something he hadn't done since he was 7 years old and believed in promises. He chose to have faith. Alexander found Elena in her studio on a Tuesday morning, but it barely resembled the space where they'd spent 6 weeks discovering each other. Canvases were stacked against walls, easels collapsed and bundled, painting supplies packed into boxes labeled in Elena's careful handwriting. The life had been systematically drained from the room, leaving only echoes of the creativity that had once filled every corner. Elena stood at the center of it all, wearing paint-stained overalls and holding a cup of coffee that had clearly gone cold hours ago. She was studying the one remaining canvas on an easel, the painting of the couple sharing coffee on a park bench, their hands almost touching. The piece she'd been working on the morning, everything fell apart. "I knocked," Alexander said quietly from the doorway. The door was open. Elena turned, and he saw that she'd been crying. Not the fresh tears of recent grief, but the exhausted remnants of days spent mourning something she'd thought might last forever. "The new tenants take possession tomorrow," she said, as if that explained everything. "I'm almost finished packing." Alexander stepped into the space, his expensive shoes echoing strangely in the emptiness. "Elena, I came to apologize? You already did that. In your text messages, your voicemails, the flowers you sent." Elena's voice wasn't angry, which somehow made it worse. It was tired, resigned. "I know you're sorry, Alexander. But sorry doesn't fix the fundamental problem." "What fundamental problem?" Elena set down her coffee cup and faced him fully. "You don't trust me." "Not really." "Oh, you want to, and when everything's going well, you can almost convince yourself that you do. But the moment someone plants a seed of doubt, you immediately assume the worst about my intentions." "That's not." "It is, and you know it." Elena's voice grew gentle, which broke Alexander's heart more than anger would have. "And I understand why. I understand about your father and the lessons he taught you and the way you learned to protect yourself. But understanding doesn't make it hurt less when you look at me like I'm the enemy." Alexander pulled the painting she'd sent him from the bag he'd been carrying. "Is this how you see me?" Elena looked at her own work, the portrait of Alexander as she saw him, vulnerable and strong and worth choosing to trust. "Yes." "Then why did you paint it if you don't believe I can change?" "Because I wanted you to see what I see. I wanted you to understand that you're not broken, Alexander. You're just scared." Elena moved to the window, looking out at the alley where morning light struggled through urban haze. "But I can't love you into trusting me. That's work you have to do yourself." Alexander studied the painting in his hands, seeing himself through Elena's eyes, not as his father's son or a walking bank account or a collection of defensive strategies, but as a man capable of love and worthy of it. "I fired Marcus," he said quietly. Elena turned, surprise flickering across her face. "What?" "I fired Marcus Webb. Yesterday. After I spent 3 days investigating what really happened with the community meetings." Alexander set the painting carefully against a packed box. "Do you know what I found?" "Alexander." "I found emails. Lots of them. Marcus had been feeding information to a competing development firm, trying to sabotage the project from the inside. When that didn't work, he decided to eliminate what he saw as my biggest vulnerability." Elena's eyes widened. "Me? You?" He knew that if he could make me distrust you, I'd retreat back into the isolation that's made me such an easy mark for people like him. Alexander's voice grew stronger. He was counting on my fear to do his work for him. And it worked. For 3 days, yes. It worked perfectly. Alexander moved closer, close enough that Elena could see the exhaustion in his gray eyes, the evidence of sleepless nights and the kind of soul-searching that left marks. But then I realized something. What? I was letting my father win. Even though he's been dead for 5 years, I was still letting his voice in my head make my choices. Alexander's hands trembled slightly. I was choosing his legacy over my future, his fear over your love. Elena felt tears sting her eyes. Alexander. You were right about everything. I've been so afraid of being hurt that I've been guaranteeing I'd end up alone. I've been so focused on protecting myself from betrayal that I couldn't recognize loyalty when it was standing right in front of me, defending me to people who had every reason to distrust me. Alexander pulled out his phone and showed Elena a recording. This is from the community meeting last Thursday. The one you attended after I accused you of betraying me. Elena's voice came through the phone speakers, clear and passionate. Alexander Sterling is not his reputation. He's not the corporate raider the newspapers make him out to be. He's someone who remembers the names of janitors and asks about their families. He's someone who builds affordable housing into luxury developments because he knows what it feels like to be displaced. He's someone who listens when people tell him their stories and changes his plans to honor what they need. Alexander stopped the recording. You defended me even after I hurt you. Even after I proved that I was everything you were afraid I might be. You're not, though. Elena wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. You're scared and wounded, and sometimes you make choices from that fear instead of from your heart. But you're not cruel or calculating or irredeemable. How can you still believe that after what I did? Elena smiled through her tears. Because I see people's souls, remember? And your soul is beautiful, Alexander Sterling. Damaged, maybe, but beautiful. Alexander felt something break open in his chest. Not the sharp crack of something shattering, but the slow, necessary breaking of walls that had served their purpose and now needed to come down. Elena Rodriguez, he said, echoing words from their first meeting, I see someone who's forgotten what it feels like to be loved the way she deserves. Elena's breath caught. Alexander. But I also see someone who's been willing to wait while a stubborn, scared billionaire figured out that trust isn't something you earn once and keep forever. It's something you choose, every day, especially when it's hard. Alexander stepped closer, close enough that Elena could see paint stains on his expensive shirt sleeve. I'm choosing to trust you, Elena. Not because I'm not afraid, but because you're worth being afraid for. And I'm choosing to trust you to keep choosing, Elena whispered. They came together in the center of the empty studio, surrounded by the remnants of Elena's old life and the possibility of something new. When Alexander kissed her, it felt like a promise, not the kind his father had taught him to break, but the kind Elena had taught him to keep. I have a proposition, Alexander said against her lips. More business deals. The best one I've ever made. Alexander pulled back to look at her. There's a building in Soho. Perfect light, incredible space, room for studios and a gallery. It needs someone who understands artists, who can see souls and help other people see them too. Elena's eyes widened. Alexander, I can't let you. It's not charity. It's an investment. In art, in community. In the future, I want to build with someone who taught me that the most valuable things can't be bought. Alexander's smile was soft and sure. What do you say, Elena Rodriguez? Want to help a reformed cynic learn what it really means to trust? Elena looked around the empty studio, then back at Alexander, at his hopeful eyes, his paint-stained shirt, his hands that were finally steady because he'd stopped expecting them to be empty. I say yes, she whispered. To all of it. As afternoon light filled the empty studio, Alexander Sterling and Elena Rodriguez held each other close and made plans for a future built not on the fear of what they might lose, but on the faith of what they'd already found. They'd learned that trust wasn't a luxury after all. It was the foundation upon which everything else worth having could be built. And sometimes, the most beautiful things began with someone brave enough to say, I see you, and someone else courageous enough to believe they were worth seeing. Outside, the city hummed with its usual chaos of ambition and desire, but inside Elena's studio, two people who'd forgotten how to trust had remembered how to hope. It was exactly where their story was always meant to begin.
Thank you for watching this story to the end. If you enjoyed this story, you will surely love the next one. It's as crazier and more intriguing as you can ever imagine. So do check it out. Click on the image showing on your screen right now to watch the next one.